Pawn f2, f4. Knight g8, f6. Knight g1, f3. Pawn g7, g6. Pawn b2, b3. Bishop f8, g7. Bishop c1, b2. Castles kingside. Pawn d2, d3. Pawn d7, d5.
In response to the artsy game, White's blacks develop in the spirit of Fischer's favorite defense Grunfeld.
Knight b1, d2. Knight f6, g4.
Exploiting insecurity, bishop b2, black with a huge force their horse on e3.
Bishop b2 takes bishop g7. Knight g4, e3. Queen d1, c1. King g8 takes bishop g7. Queen c1, b2. Pawn f7, f6. Pawn d3, d4. Bishop c8, f5.
And now they are already appearing specific threats.
Rook a1, c1. Knight b8, c6. Queen b2, c3. Knight e3 takes bishop f1. Knight d2 takes knight f1. Queen d8, d6. Pawn e2, e3. Knight c6, b4. Queen c3, b2.
Natural move. Need defender 2. But now black delivers a beautiful blow.
Bishop f5 takes pawn c2. King e1, d2.
The triple fork on d3 prevents white from taking two easy pieces behind the rook.
Rook c1 takes bishop c2. Knight b4, d3. Bishop c2, e4. Knight f3, e1. Rook a8, e8. Knight f1, g3. Pawn e7, e5.
White has a pawn less their king is stuck in the center and blacks continue to own initiative.
Rook h1, f1. Pawn e5 takes pawn d4. Queen b2 takes pawn d4. Pawn b7, b6. Pawn a2, a3. Pawn c7, c5. Queen d4, b2. Knight b4, c6. Knight g3 takes bishop e4. Rook e8 takes knight e4.
The outcome of the game is predetermined. Black is preparing to show line D, connecting heavy figures to attack. Salvation for whites are not visible.
Knight e1, f3. Pawn d5, d4. Queen b2, c2. Rook e4 takes pawn e3.
The whites surrendered. Then it could be like this.
Rook c1, e1. Rook e3, c3. Queen c2, b2. Knight c6, a5. King d2, e2. Rook c3 takes pawn b3. Queen b2, a1. Queen d6 takes pawn f4. Rook f1, f2. Queen f4, e3. King e2, f1. Rook b3 takes pawn a3. Queen a1, b2. Queen e3, c3. Queen b2, b1. Rook f8, e8. Rook e1, d1. Knight a5, c4. King f1, g1. Queen c3, b3. Queen b1, c1. Knight c4, e3. Rook d1, e1. Rook a3, a2. Rook f2, e2. Pawn a7, a5. Pawn h2, h3. King g7, f7. Rook e2, f2. Rook a2 takes rook f2. King g1 takes rook f2. Queen b3, a2. Queen c1, d2. Queen a2 takes queen d2. Knight f3 takes queen d2. Pawn c5, c4. Knight d2, f3. Knight e3, c2. Rook e1, b1. Rook e8, e6. Pawn g2, g4. Pawn d4, d3. Rook b1, d1. Pawn b6, b5. Pawn g4, g5. Rook e6, e2. King f2, g3. Pawn a5, a4. Knight f3, d2. Knight c2, e3. Rook d1, b1. Knight e3, f5. King g3, f3. Pawn c4, c3. Knight d2, e4. Pawn c3, c2. Rook b1, c1. Knight f5, d4. King f3, f4. Rook e2 takes knight e4. King f4 takes rook e4. Pawn d3, d2. Rook c1 takes pawn c2. Knight d4 takes rook c2. King e4, d5. Pawn d2, d1.